So here's our early data on the effect of project-based learning on closing the gap in CMSD. So this first graph is all schools. So we identified 13 schools. These are not necessarily the schools that just opted in as demonstration of learning schools. These are 13 schools that we know have been teaching with this PBL pedagogy. It's a mix of high school and K-8 schools. So this is performance index. So even if we look at 2021, these PBL schools started higher than the other schools because they have been teaching this way for longer, right? They didn't just start in 2021. So we feel like that's why they started out even higher than the other schools. And they're growing at a pretty consistent rate with each other if we're looking at just performance index. If we look at our schools that are in K-8, it actually looks a little here like our traditional schools are starting to close the gap. So this is one of the things that we want to investigate what's happening here. Why are these traditional schools starting to close the gap? But even though they're closing the gap, our PBL schools are still outperforming them. In our high schools, though, our PBL schools are way outperforming our traditional schools. So this was like a big eye-opener for us. If nothing else, this really, really is an effective strategy for our high schools. So that was looking at performance index. If we look at growth, so for this data, we took our PBL schools and compared them with a traditional school, like a one-to-one comparison. So for all 13 PBL schools, we looked at 13 traditional schools that kind of partnered with each of those. So if we look at overall growth, our PBL schools are outgrowing our traditional schools from 2022 to 2023. And this is just the K-8s. If we look at reading, they're way outperforming our schools, PBL versus traditional schools. And we believe that's happening because no matter what the content area is in a PBL classroom, there's such a heavy focus on reading, writing, and speaking that those reading scores are going to go up no matter where you're implementing this pedagogy. And in math, interestingly enough, the traditional schools are outgrowing the PBL schools. So that's one of the things that we want to look into. Like I can say it is more challenging to implement in a math class than in English, science, social studies, art, what have you. And those have been more resistant teachers to implement project-based learning, so there might be something to why they're experiencing less growth. So I'm curious to get in to look at like the level of implementation in those math classrooms to see what's happening there. Now, if we look at high school, huge difference in growth between our PBL schools and our traditional schools. Our traditional schools actually regressed in some content areas while the PBL schools showed that growth. But what I thought was interesting here is in ELA 2, right, which you would think it would go up. That one had the reverse effect of in our K-8 schools where our students in reading experience more growth.